In the heart of the Rocky Mountains, survival isn't just about living, it's about outsmarting nature itself. Samuel Bridger, a seasoned trapper, thought he had mastered the wilderness. But when a grizzly bear shattered his world, he set out to build a cabin that would defy even the harshest of the wild. Little did he know, his obsession with safety would change everything. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode holds an even greater tale of innovation born from desperation. The wind howled with unrelenting ferocity as the mountain stood frozen, its towering peaks cast in shadows of ice. Samuel Bridger had seen many winters in these remote corners of the Rocky Mountains, each colder than the last. But this winter felt different. The snow piled high, burying everything in a silent white blanket. Each gust of wind bit deep into his skin, a reminder of how fragile life truly was here, in the wilderness that had become his home. Inside the modest cabin, Samuel kept to his task, his breath visible in the frigid air. The fire in the hearth had long died down, unable to fight the biting cold that seemed to seep into every crack and crevice of the structure. The small log cabin, hastily built during his early days as a trapper, had always been enough. But after 7 grueling winters, Samuel had begun to realize that no cabin, no matter how sturdy, could ever truly protect him from the dangers that lurked outside. He had lost partners to the harshness of this land before, men who had succumbed to starvation, disease, and animal attacks. But none of that had prepared him for the horror he felt the day he lost John Hoffman, a fellow trapper who had become his closest friend. It was late in the afternoon when Samuel first heard the distant gunshots echoing through the valley. 3 rapid shots, followed by a haunting silence. He had never been one to panic, but this time was different. Samuel grabbed his rifle and rushed toward the sound of the gunfire, his heart pounding with each step. When he arrived, what he found was a sight he would never forget. John was dead, torn apart by the claws of a grizzly bear. The animal had attacked without warning, its primal fury leaving John with little chance to defend himself. The bear had likely been on the hunt, and John's unfortunate proximity to the trap lines had sealed his fate. Samuel knelt beside his partner's lifeless body, grief flooding his chest. It was a brutal reminder of the unforgiving nature of the wilderness. With a heavy heart, Samuel buried John in a small, quiet grave, marked only by a pile of stones. He spent the night alone in the cabin, unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of survival. He had always known that the wilderness could be deadly, but now, after losing someone he had considered family, the dangers felt more real, more immediate. And he realized in that quiet, desolate moment that the cabin, the very thing he had always relied on to keep him safe, wasn't enough. The door was weak, the walls were too thin, and the windows, open to the wild, were vulnerable. If a grizzly could kill one of his friends so easily, what chance did he have of surviving another winter? The thought gnawed at him throughout the night, and by morning a new obsession had taken root. He would rebuild, not just a new cabin, but something stronger, something that could withstand even the most brutal forces of nature. He would build a fortress. The days following John's death were filled with an unshakable sense of urgency. Samuel's hands shook with the weight of what he had just experienced, but his mind burned with a singular purpose: to create something that would protect him, something that would stand firm against the merciless forces of the wilderness. He spent countless hours in the woods, studying every tree, every rock, every element that could be used in his quest to build a cabin unlike any other. He didn't have the luxury of time. Winter was already upon him, and the harshest months were still to come. But Samuel wasn't one to rush a job that could cost him his life. He knew that every detail mattered: the strength of the logs, the placement of each beam, the technique of the construction. He began to reject the methods of the other trappers who had always relied on simple, quick solutions. They built cabins that were good enough to survive a season, but Samuel had no interest in good enough. He needed something built to last. With a determination that only those who had survived the wilderness could understand, Samuel spent the next few weeks gathering materials. He knew that he could never truly protect himself from everything, but he was determined to give himself the best chance. He chose the finest logs he could find, rejecting anything that wasn't perfectly straight and sturdy. Each log was carefully stripped of its bark, each corner meticulously shaped to fit seamlessly with the others. Samuel's method was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. While the other trappers built their cabins in a matter of days, he worked tirelessly day after day, building a structure that he hoped would keep him alive when the worst came. Every piece of wood was carefully placed, each log notched and pinned with precision. He took no shortcuts. His obsession grew with each passing day. This wasn't just about building a shelter. It was about building a fortress that could withstand the forces of nature itself. He found himself working late into the nights, the glow of his lantern illuminating the dark forest around him. The wind howled through the trees, but inside his makeshift construction, Samuel could almost imagine what the cabin would be like once it was completed. Warm, secure, a place where he could feel safe once more. But the reality was harsh. There was still much to do, and every moment was a battle against time and the elements. But Samuel's determination never wavered. He had set out to build something extraordinary, and he was willing to sacrifice everything to see it through. The world outside might be brutal and unforgiving, but inside this cabin, Samuel would not be a victim. He would survive, and in doing so, he would create a legacy that would outlast him. Samuel's obsession deepened with each passing day. The sound of his axe biting into wood became his constant companion, and the rhythm of his labor was the only thing that kept his thoughts from drifting back to John and the grim reality of life in the wild. He spent his evenings studying the cabin, imagining it in his mind, every beam, every log, every detail meticulously designed for one purpose: survival. He had begun with a simple concept: strength. But now it was more than that. The materials he chose were no longer just wood and stone, they were a fortress in the making. As Samuel worked, he thought back to the cabins he had seen in the past, the ones that had fallen victim to bears, storms, and time. He realized that their weakness was in their design. Their foundations were inadequate, their corners vulnerable, their roofs easily breached by the elements. These structures, however sturdy they appeared at first, would never stand the test of nature's fury. His mind began to turn to a different kind of construction, one that went beyond the ordinary. Samuel sought to combine the best of both worlds, the simplicity of frontier living with the security and durability of formal architecture. He had no formal training in carpentry, but he had spent enough time in towns like St. Louis to observe craftsmen at work. He had learned from watching bricklayers, carpenters, and masons, noting how they used interlocking patterns to add strength to their buildings. Now he would apply those same principles to his cabin, using logs instead of stone, nails instead of mortar. The foundation would be his first major innovation. Unlike the other cabins, which sat directly on the cold, unforgiving earth, Samuel dug a shallow trench around the perimeter of his cabin and filled it with rocks. This would elevate the structure, preventing the logs from shifting and settling over time. It was a small change, but it was crucial, one that would make the cabin more stable and less prone to shifting in the winter freeze. Next, Samuel focused on the logs themselves. He chose only the straightest, most uniform trees he could find. Most trappers would have settled for whatever trees were nearby, but Samuel wasn't interested in taking shortcuts. He spent weeks cutting and hauling the best logs he could find, stripping the bark from each one with a draw knife to ensure a tight, secure fit. It was back-breaking work, but the thought of how easily a bear could tear apart a poorly built cabin kept him going. His attention to detail extended to every corner, every connection between the logs. Traditional cabins were notched at the corners, a simple and effective method, but one that created inherent weaknesses. Samuel rejected this method entirely, choosing instead to extend the logs beyond the corners, creating overlapping extensions that would be pinned together with iron nails. This technique, inspired by his observations of stone construction, would ensure that the corners of the cabin were virtually indestructible. As the cabin slowly began to take shape, Samuel found himself spending less time on the traps he had set and more time on the construction. Each day he would wake early, work through the morning and afternoon, and then spend the evening shaping logs and perfecting his design. There were moments when he doubted his ability to finish in time. The winter was closing in, and every storm that passed made him feel more and more vulnerable. But with every piece of wood he placed, he could feel the security growing. This cabin, his fortress, was becoming more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of his defiance against the wild, a declaration that he would not be broken by the harshness of this land. By mid-December, Samuel's cabin was beginning to take shape. The framework was in place, the foundation solid, and the roof, while still incomplete, was already far sturdier than anything he had ever seen before. But as the first real snowstorm of the season rolled in, Samuel knew that the true test of his work was still to come. The storm was fierce, and the wind howled like a living creature, sweeping across the snow-covered mountains and rattling the wooden frame of his cabin. Inside it was quiet, almost too quiet. The crackling of the fire in the hearth was the only sound, providing a comforting warmth that seeped into Samuel's tired bones. He had worked tirelessly over the past few weeks, and though the cabin wasn't finished, he had reached a point where he felt somewhat secure. But with the storm raging outside, the sense of security was fleeting. No matter how well built the cabin was, it could never be truly safe until it had been tested by the forces that had once claimed so many lives. Samuel spent the night in restless thought, his eyes flicking between the snow falling outside and the incomplete cabin. As the storm grew more intense, the howling wind seemed to challenge the strength of the structure. Would it hold up? He had spent so much time designing it, obsessing over every detail, but in the back of his mind, doubts lingered. The other trappers would call it foolish, this obsession with construction, but Samuel had always been different. To him, this cabin was more than just a shelter. It was a necessity, a means of survival in a world that had already taken so much from him. By the time morning came, the storm had passed, but Samuel was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The cabin had held up well, though. The foundation had stayed firm. The walls were solid, and the roof, though still unfinished, had kept out the worst of the storm. It wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from the rickety cabins most trappers relied on. And it was enough, for now. But Samuel knew that the cabin's true test would come when he least expected it. Nature, as he had learned the hard way, could not be predicted. A bear, a blizzard, or even a simple misstep could end it all. So he worked even harder in the following days, reinforcing the cabin where he could, finishing the last details, and adding a few final touches to ensure that it would be ready when the next storm came. He could feel the tension building, as though the wilderness itself were watching him, waiting to see if he had truly succeeded. The mountain, which had once seemed so full of promise, now felt more like a battleground, and Samuel Bridger, the mountain man who had once thought he could survive anything, was about to face his greatest challenge yet, one that would test not just his cabin, but his very will to survive. It was late in January when Samuel first encountered a force that could break through his fortress. The snow had fallen steadily for days, piling up against the walls of the cabin, turning the wilderness into a vast frozen sea. The air outside was brittle, each breath he took a sharp reminder of just how cold the world could be. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary, warm and secure, the fire crackling steadily in the hearth. For a moment, it felt as if he had finally outwitted nature itself. But the wilderness had other plans. Samuel had been working tirelessly, as usual, reinforcing the roof and adding extra layers of chinking between the logs. His obsession with detail never waned, even when he felt the weight of fatigue pressing against him. He'd been too busy to check the trap lines the last few days, and as he stood by the window in the dim light of the cabin, something caught his eye. The snow, which had been untouched for days, was disturbed. Large, deep paw prints led directly toward his cabin. His heart skipped a beat. A bear. The tracks were fresh, the edges still sharp in the snow. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He knew this was a possibility, the very reason he had worked so hard to make the cabin impenetrable. But seeing the signs so close, feeling the sudden wave of vulnerability, made everything more real. The bear wasn't just out there anymore, it was at his doorstep. He grabbed his rifle, the cold steel in his hands comforting but unsettling all at once. The cabin had passed the tests of snow and wind, but the real challenge would be a grizzly's fury. Samuel moved to the small gun port he had designed into the wall, a narrow slit in the logs that would allow him to see outside without exposing himself. He watched through the crack in the wood, eyes scanning the snow, waiting for the beast to reveal itself. Minutes dragged on like hours. The howling wind filled the space, and Samuel could feel the tension, tightening in his chest. It wasn't just about survival now, it was about proving to himself that his design would stand up to nature's might. The air inside the cabin seemed to freeze, even as the warmth from the hearth began to fade. Then it came. The bear, massive and terrifying, stepped into view, its enormous form moving deliberately through the snow. It stood on its hind legs, sniffing the air, its powerful claws scraping at the snow. Samuel's pulse quickened. The bear was testing his cabin, just as he'd feared. It was the door that the bear first attacked. Samuel watched, his finger tight on the rifle's trigger. The grizzly's claws dug into the wood, scraping at the logs. But the door, reinforced with Samuel's iron brackets and thick planks, held firm. The bear's frustration was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed to be testing every inch of the structure. It tried the corners, the walls, and even reached for the window. But the cabin stood strong. After what felt like an eternity, the bear finally turned, its curiosity unfulfilled, and walked back into the forest. Samuel's breath came in ragged gasps. The cabin had withstood its first test, but just barely. He knew this encounter would be remembered in every joint of his body, a reminder that no matter how well built, nature would never be tamed. He took a long, slow breath, lowering his rifle. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, Samuel felt something shift within him. His creation had held up, and though he couldn't yet claim victory over the wilderness, he knew this was just the beginning. The mountain would continue to test him, and so too would his cabin. But for now, he had survived the first breach. By the time February arrived, Samuel's cabin had become a sanctuary of sorts, a testament to his obsession, his survival instincts, and his unwillingness to accept anything less than perfection. The grizzly attack had left its mark, but in a way, it had only fueled Samuel's drive to further refine and improve the structure. He had spent the past month adding more layers to the roof, reinforcing weak points, and doubling down on the intricate details that made his cabin more secure than any other. Yet with every improvement he made, he also felt the weight of the cost. The time spent away from his traps, the physical toll on his body, and the mounting isolation. Each day added a bit more pressure. Samuel hadn't expected it to be easy, but the sacrifice had begun to feel like an endless loop of labor. The days were long, and the nights felt even longer. Though the storm outside continued to pound the wilderness, the real battle was taking place inside Samuel's own mind. The obsession with perfecting the cabin had begun to take its toll on his sanity. His mind often raced, his thoughts filled with the very structure he had spent so much time building. There were moments when he wondered if the cabin had become a prison of his own making. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Samuel finally sat down, looking at the intricate wooden walls that surrounded him. The logs were perfectly placed, the windows reinforced with thick shutters, and the roof was more solid than anything he had ever seen. But there was still one thing he couldn't ignore: his own exhaustion. The weeks spent working without rest had begun to drain him. His muscles ached from the relentless labor, and his hands, rough from hours spent shaping wood, felt like they might give out at any moment. He hadn't seen another soul in weeks, and the isolation, once a comfort, was now beginning to weigh heavily on him. Samuel had built the cabin with one thing in mind: survival. But as he sat there staring at the walls, he realized he had neglected something else: the need for human connection. His obsession with the cabin had left him disconnected from the world outside, and now the silence seemed deafening. Even the presence of the grizzly, terrifying as it had been, felt like a reminder of what he had lost. He had sacrificed everything to create a sanctuary, yet he had forgotten the simple human need for companionship and community. As the days passed, Samuel began to wonder if he had made a mistake in focusing so relentlessly on building a perfect fortress. He had been so consumed with surviving the elements, surviving the beasts of the wild, that he had forgotten the one thing that made survival truly worth it: connection to others. He thought about the trappers he had known, the camaraderie that existed among those who worked together in the harshest conditions. But that was a life he had abandoned, chasing an ideal that in the end might not be enough. The winds outside howled louder, and Samuel looked out through the small gun port. The world was silent except for the wind. He had built a stronghold, a monument to his will. But deep down, he knew that survival wasn't just about keeping the elements at bay. It was about the people who would share that survival with him. And without that, even the strongest walls would never be enough. March arrived in a burst of bitter winds and thick snow, but the days were beginning to stretch longer. Samuel noticed the shift, the way the light lingered longer in the afternoon, the way the ground beneath the thick layer of snow seemed to pulse with the promise of spring. He could feel the seasons changing, but inside he felt stuck, as though the weight of his cabin's construction had frozen him in place. The storm from the previous night had left a layer of snow so deep that it almost obscured the door. But it wasn't the storm or the cold that kept Samuel locked inside. It was the creeping sense of isolation that gnawed at him, a feeling he hadn't quite recognized until now. He had been so focused on surviving, on building his fortress, that he had forgotten about the simple human need for connection, the need to share the experience of survival. His cabin was a marvel of craftsmanship, but its walls had also become a barrier between him and everything he had once known. Samuel stood by the small window, his eyes scanning the wilderness beyond. There were no tracks in the fresh snow, no signs of life, not even a bird in the trees. The silence outside mirrored the silence inside, a quiet that had become suffocating. He had built a place of safety, a place where he could survive any storm, any animal attack. But in doing so, he had built a cage around himself. He hadn't realized just how much he missed the sound of human voices, the laughter around the campfire, the shared stories, the camaraderie of the trapping life. His thoughts turned to the men he had known, those who had come and gone over the years. Some of them had died, some had left to seek their fortune elsewhere, but Samuel had always thought he could handle the solitude. Now, it felt like a weight too heavy to bear. The evening grew darker, and the fire crackled in the hearth, but Samuel barely noticed it. His mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the moment when John Hoffman had been taken by the grizzly. That loss had shaken him deeply, but it had also fueled his determination to create something that would never fail him. And yet, here he was, alone in the cabin he had built, haunted by the silence of his own thoughts. The isolation had crept up on him slowly, a silent companion to his work. He had convinced himself that being alone was the price of survival, that it was worth the sacrifice of human connection. But now he wasn't so sure. He realized that no matter how strong the walls of his cabin were, no matter how many times it withstood the storms or the beasts, it could never protect him from the gnawing ache of loneliness. With a sigh, Samuel turned away from the window and moved to the corner of the cabin where he had stacked the supplies he had gathered over the winter. The firelight flickered across the wooden walls, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. He had built this place to be a fortress against nature, but now he realized it was also a fortress against himself, and that was a price too high to pay. It was a week into March when Samuel's world shifted again, not through the winds or the snow, but through the unexpected sound of a knock at the door. It was a sound that broke the spell of silence, a sound so foreign to him that for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. He stood frozen, his hand gripping the rifle by the hearth. It had been so long since anyone had come by, and the thought of a visitor, especially in the middle of a snowstorm, felt almost surreal. He moved cautiously toward the door, his boots crunching on the snow-covered floorboards. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his own isolation pressing down on him. When he reached the door, he hesitated. He hadn't seen another soul in months. Was it a trapper, a lost traveler, or something else entirely? The wilderness had a way of changing a man, making him suspicious of even the most ordinary of sounds. But Samuel knew one thing: he couldn't remain holed up in this cabin forever. The world outside had not forgotten him, and maybe it was time to re-enter it. He opened the door slowly, the thick wood creaking as it moved. There, standing in the doorway, was a man. The stranger was bundled up in thick furs, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a heavy hood. His breath came out in clouds as he stood in the doorway, waiting, as if unsure of how to proceed. Samuel instinctively reached for his rifle, but the stranger raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Don't shoot," the man said, his voice rough from the cold. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Samuel eyed him carefully, unsure of the man's intentions. But something about the stranger's worn appearance, the weathered face, the tired eyes, told Samuel that this was no ordinary wanderer. The man was a trapper, no doubt, but not one from these parts. His clothes were unlike anything Samuel had seen before, rough but well worn, and his boots were caked with snow, as if he had been walking for days. "Who are you?" Samuel asked, his voice cold but not unkind. "My name's Caleb," the stranger said, his eyes scanning the cabin behind Samuel. "I've been traveling for weeks, trying to find a place to shelter. The storm's worse than I expected. I saw your smoke and, well, I thought I'd take my chances." Samuel didn't know what to make of it. It had been so long since anyone had sought him out, and the sudden intrusion felt jarring. But as he looked into Caleb's eyes, he saw no malice, only exhaustion, and the same weariness he had felt so many times before. After a moment, Samuel nodded, stepping aside. "Come in, then. It's no place for a man to be outside in a storm like this." Caleb nodded gratefully and stepped inside. As he shed his furs and made his way to the hearth, Samuel watched him carefully. He could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just a random encounter. There was something about Caleb that felt familiar, as though this moment was inevitable. He had built this cabin to keep the world out, to protect himself from the wilderness. But now, standing in the glow of the fire, he realized that he had built it as much to keep others out as to keep himself safe. The silence that had once plagued him seemed to fade as Caleb sat down by the fire, his weathered face softening with the warmth. And for the first time in months, Samuel felt a flicker of something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a connection to the world outside. As the storm raged on outside, the fire crackled in the hearth, and Samuel found himself sitting across from Caleb, watching the man thaw before the warmth of the flames. His new guest had removed his wet boots, the soles still steaming slightly, and stretched out his hands toward the fire. Caleb's weary eyes met Samuel's, and for a long moment neither man spoke. The weight of isolation still pressed heavily on Samuel's chest. For so long he had been alone, his thoughts as solitary as the mountain itself. But now, in the flickering light of the fire, something seemed to shift. The quiet that had once suffocated him now felt different. It was a shared silence, an acknowledgement that both men had been through their own struggles, each in their own way. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice rough from the cold and the journey. "I've been walking for weeks," he said, his gaze distant, as if the words were as much for himself as for Samuel. "I got separated from my crew. The storm took me off course, and I ended up further north than I meant to. The cold's been brutal. I thought I'd freeze before I found anyone." Samuel nodded, understanding all too well the harshness of the wilderness. He had known the struggle of survival, the constant battle against the elements, the isolation. But even more than that, he knew the unspoken bond that existed between men who had braved these wild lands. There was no need for grand explanations. They had both survived. "You're welcome to stay," Samuel said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He wasn't used to inviting anyone into his space, his fortress. But the cabin, once so suffocating in its silence, felt different now. It wasn't just his creation anymore. It had room for others, room for shared humanity. Caleb gave a small nod of thanks, his gaze lingering on the fire for a moment before returning to Samuel. "I appreciate it. Haven't seen a friendly face in feels like forever." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it was filled with the understanding of two men who had survived their own personal battles. They didn't need to explain everything. The quiet was enough. After a moment, Caleb spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You built this place yourself, didn't you?" Samuel's eyes flicked over to the logs, the walls, the roof that had taken so many months to complete. It had been an act of obsession, a quest for survival, and yet here in the warmth of a shared fire, it felt more like a labor of necessity than anything else. "I did," Samuel said, his voice low. "Took me nearly a year to get it right." Caleb smiled faintly. "I can see that. I've never seen anything quite like it. It's strong, isn't it?" "It needs to be," Samuel replied, his voice hardening with the memory of that first encounter with the grizzly. "I've had my reasons for building it this way. You can't trust the wilderness. It'll take you if you're not careful." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Caleb didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight and closed his eyes for a moment, as though lost in thought. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "No, when I first came out here, I thought I could survive alone. I thought I could handle anything this land threw at me. But after a while, you start to realize something. You can't do it alone. Not really." Samuel's eyes met Caleb's, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him. The truth of Caleb's words struck deep. He had built this cabin, this fortress, believing that it would protect him from everything: bears, storms, the unforgiving cold. But the one thing it couldn't protect him from was the emptiness of being alone. "You're right," Samuel said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of unspoken truths. "You can't, no matter how strong the walls are." Caleb nodded, and for a moment the two men sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire. But it wasn't a silence of isolation. It was a silence that spoke volumes. Two men who had both learned that survival meant more than just standing against the elements. It was about sharing the weight, finding connection in the places where you least expected it. The storm outside had lost some of its bite by morning, leaving behind a world blanketed in soft snow. The air was crisp, cold enough to freeze the breath in Samuel's lungs, but the cabin was warm, a sanctuary against the relentless wilderness. Samuel and Caleb had spent the night talking, sharing stories of their lives before the mountains, before the isolation. The fire had burned low by the time they had both fallen asleep, but for the first time in a long time, Samuel didn't feel the weight of solitude. As daylight broke through the thick clouds outside, Caleb stirred, stretching his arms toward the ceiling. The shadows in the cabin shifted, revealing the rough-hewn logs that had become Samuel's life work. He glanced over at the sleeping figure of the trapper who had arrived the night before, a faint smile crossing his lips. The cabin felt different today, less like a prison and more like a home. When Caleb awoke fully, he moved over to the window and peered outside, his expression thoughtful. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice a little hoarse from the cold, "but it's also harsh. You really can't survive out here on your own." Samuel watched him from across the room, the weight of the man's words lingering between them. He had spent so many months building this place with the intent of isolating himself from the world, and now, standing in the light of the morning, with Caleb by the window, Samuel realized how much he had underestimated the power of human connection. "I've learned that," Samuel replied softly, his gaze falling on the hearth where the fire had started to burn low. "There's strength in being alone, but there's more strength in being with someone else. We weren't made to live in isolation." Caleb turned, meeting Samuel's eyes. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. "You built this place to protect yourself," he said. "But what's the point of surviving if you don't have anyone to share it with?" Samuel didn't have an immediate answer. He had spent so much of his life trying to survive the wilderness, trying to outsmart nature. But Caleb's words hit home. What was survival without someone to share the victory with? What good was a fortress if there was no one to stand alongside you when the storm hit? The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable this time. Instead, it was full of possibility. They had both survived the harshness of the wilderness, but now, in the warmth of the cabin, Samuel realized that survival wasn't just about what you built. It was about who you built it with. The morning sun poured into the cabin, casting a soft glow over the rough-hewn logs. For the first time in a long time, Samuel felt something other than loneliness. It wasn't just the warmth of the fire. It was the warmth of knowing that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. "Maybe we can survive together," Samuel said, his voice steady. "Maybe that's the way it's meant to be." The days that followed Caleb's arrival were a strange blend of relief and tension. The cabin, once a place of isolation, now felt filled with the soft hum of shared activity. Caleb had quickly fallen into the rhythms of Samuel's life, tending the fire, fixing what needed fixing, and even checking the trap lines together. For the first time since John's death, Samuel found himself sharing his burdens with another man, and it brought a new sense of purpose to his days. But with that newfound connection came a quiet undercurrent of unease. Samuel had worked so long and so hard to carve out a space that was entirely his fortress against nature, his retreat from the dangers of the world. Now, there was someone else here, someone who wasn't just a guest but a partner of sorts, and that was something Samuel wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. Caleb's presence reminded Samuel of the fragility of everything he had worked for. Despite the warmth of the fire and the comfort of companionship, Samuel couldn't help but feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. Every time Caleb picked up a tool or ventured out into the wilderness to check the traps, Samuel found himself wondering if he was making the right choice by letting someone else into this space. Could his fortress still be his own, or had it already become something else, something shared? The change was subtle at first, a quick glance from Caleb as he set to work in the morning, the soft scrape of a knife against wood as Samuel trimmed another log. These small moments felt unfamiliar now, like the cabin's walls were pressing in just a little tighter. The silence of solitude too far behind to return. And then, one evening, after a long day of working together, it happened. Samuel had been sharpening his axe by the fire when Caleb spoke, his voice hesitant. "You know, Samuel," Caleb said, "I've been thinking. You've done a lot here, built something solid, but I don't think that's all you're looking for, is it?" Samuel paused, the edge of the axe blade catching the flickering light from the hearth. He felt a weight in the air, something unsaid. Hanging between them, his hand gripped the axe tighter. "What do you mean?" Samuel replied, his voice rough, betraying the unease he felt. Caleb looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I think you've built more than just a cabin, I think you've built a wall, not just against the wilderness, but against people, against yourself." The words landed like a blow, and Samuel felt his chest tighten. For a long time he had believed that the wilderness was the greatest enemy, that survival depended on outlasting nature's threats. But Caleb's words cut deeper than any bear's claw. What if the walls he'd built around the cabin had also been built around his own heart? For a moment there was only silence. The crackling fire was the loudest sound in the cabin. Samuel didn't know how to respond. He had worked for so long to build something unshakable, something that would protect him from the cold and from grief. But now it felt as if he had been building his own prison. "I don't know what you're talking about," Samuel finally muttered, though even he knew it wasn't true. Caleb's eyes softened. "I think you do." Samuel didn't answer. He stood up abruptly, walked toward the window, and looked out into the night, his hands shaking at his sides. The moonlight glinted off the snow, casting long shadows across the land. Somewhere out there, the wilderness waited, untamed, raw, and indifferent to the weight of human hearts. But it wasn't just the wilderness that Samuel had to face. It was himself. The next few days passed quietly, but the tension between Samuel and Caleb lingered. It wasn't that they didn't speak or that their shared labor became strained. In fact, they worked as efficiently as ever. But something had shifted, like a slow crack in the foundation of the life Samuel had built. It was hard to ignore. The walls he had spent so much time reinforcing now seemed to stand between him and the world outside, and between him and Caleb. The conversations had become more sporadic, the once comfortable silences now thick with unspoken thoughts. Samuel caught Caleb watching him more often than usual, as if trying to gauge what had changed in him. But Samuel had no answers. He had built the cabin with his hands, but it seemed that the emotional walls he had erected were far harder to tear down. One afternoon, after another day of work, Caleb returned from the trap lines earlier than usual. Samuel had been preparing the evening meal, his mind still heavy with the conversation they'd had days before. He heard Caleb's boots crunching in the snow outside and felt a weight settle over him, as if something important was about to happen. When Caleb entered, he didn't speak at first, but there was something different in his eyes. He moved toward the fire, his hand brushing over the back of a chair as he settled into the warmth. "You're not a man who shares easily," Caleb said quietly after a long pause, his gaze steady on Samuel. "And I get it. The mountains have a way of teaching you that you can't rely on anyone but yourself. But that doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone." Samuel's hands tightened around the wooden spoon he was using to stir the pot. Caleb's words cut deeper than before. He had always relied on himself, his strength, his ingenuity. But what had it really cost him? What was the price of all this isolation? He had built this cabin to withstand anything, but in doing so, had he built walls that kept out the very thing he needed most? The fire crackled softly, filling the silence. Samuel's heart felt heavy, as though the cabin itself were pressing down on him. He looked over at Caleb, feeling a rush of conflicting emotions. The man had come into his life as a stranger, a fellow trapper, but now he felt more like a lifeline, a bridge to something Samuel had long since abandoned: connection. "I didn't build this to shut people out," Samuel said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I built it to survive," Caleb nodded. "I know, but survival isn't just about getting through. It's about living too." There was a long pause as Samuel turned away from the fire, his mind whirling. He had never considered that the very thing he had created to keep him alive could also be the thing that kept him from living at all. He had closed himself off for so long that the walls had become a part of him, and now, standing on the edge of something new, he realized just how much he had to learn. The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was full of understanding, full of unspoken recognition. Caleb's words hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation all at once. "You don't have to do this alone," Caleb repeated softly, his voice kind. "You've built something incredible here, but it's not just for you. It's for both of us." Samuel looked at the fire, the flames dancing as they reflected the struggle within him. He had spent so many years running from the world, running from the pain of loss and the terror of living. But now, with Caleb standing beside him, he felt something shift. Perhaps it was time to take down the walls he had so carefully constructed, not just the ones that held out the cold, but the ones that held in the heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, Samuel didn't feel so alone. He still had much to face, much to come to terms with, but with Caleb by his side, he realized that maybe survival wasn't just about keeping the wilderness at bay. It was about finding a way to let the world in. With the arrival of spring, the landscape surrounding the cabin began to shift. The snow receded, leaving patches of green and the promise of warmer days ahead. But for Samuel, this shift in the season mirrored a deeper change, one that had been stirring in him for weeks. The realization that the life he had built here, as strong and resilient as it was, had become a kind of prison. He had spent years crafting his fortress, convinced that survival in the wilderness meant isolation. But Caleb's presence had shown him another way, a way that embraced connection, shared burdens, and the possibility of something more than just enduring. The days spent working side by side, talking about their pasts and their dreams, had begun to awaken something deep within Samuel. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, watching the stars, Samuel finally spoke the words that had been lingering in his heart. "I've been thinking, Caleb. This place, it's been good to me. But it's not all there is. There's more out there, more to see, more to do. I can't stay here forever." Caleb's eyes met his, and for a moment there was only silence between them, an understanding, unspoken but clear. "The world's big, Samuel," Caleb said quietly, "and there's always more to discover. You can't live the rest of your life behind these walls." Samuel nodded, his heart heavy with the decision, yet lighter in a way he hadn't expected. The mountains had been his refuge, but now he understood it was time to face the road ahead, to leave the safety of the cabin and embrace the unknown. The morning of their departure arrived quietly, the sun barely rising above the peaks. Samuel stood at the threshold of the cabin, looking out over the land he had come to know so well. The cabin, with its sturdy walls and warm hearth, had been a place of both refuge and obsession, but now it was time to leave it behind. Caleb stood beside him, his gear already packed, a sense of calm in his expression. There was no need for words. Both men knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but it was the only way forward. "You ready?" Caleb asked, his voice steady, but filled with the quiet resolve Samuel had come to admire. Samuel glanced one last time at the cabin, the structure that had kept him safe through so much. It was still standing strong, but it had served its purpose. It was no longer a shelter from the world, it had become a cage. "I'm ready," Samuel replied, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't expected. Together they stepped away from the cabin, their boots crunching in the fresh snow as they walked toward the unknown. Behind them, the mountains loomed large, a reminder of the hardships they had overcome, but ahead, the road stretched out, a path not just of survival, but of living. The past was behind them now. The future was theirs to discover. The days following their decision to leave the cabin were filled with a strange anticipation, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that both men could feel but didn't always acknowledge. The path ahead was unknown, and while the thought of the journey filled Samuel with a renewed sense of purpose, it also brought with it a quiet fear of the world outside the mountains, fear of what awaited them once they crossed the boundary of the wilderness they had so carefully crafted. They spent the last few days preparing. The cabin, once a refuge, was now a place to pack up memories and essential supplies. Samuel carefully packed the few belongings he had accumulated over the years, his rifle, the tools he had used to build his sanctuary, a small bag of dried meats and herbs for the road. Each item felt like a link to the past, but each also felt like something he could leave behind. The life he had built here, though significant, had become a reminder of everything he had closed himself off from. Caleb, too, was preparing. The pack on his back was heavier than Samuel's, filled with food, blankets, and extra clothing for the unknown elements. Caleb had no intention of returning to the life of a solitary trapper. He wanted more, and the promise of that unknown was something Samuel found both comforting and daunting. On the morning of their departure, the air was crisp with the first hints of spring. The land softened from the thaw, but still cold to the touch. As they loaded their gear onto their backs, Samuel took one last look at the cabin. It had been more than just a home. It had been his fortress, the embodiment of his isolation and determination. But in leaving it behind, Samuel realized that what he had built wasn't just for survival. It had been a stepping stone, a necessary chapter in his journey. "I'm ready," Samuel finally said, his voice steady, but with an edge of uncertainty he hadn't expected. The weight of what they were about to do settled on him, but it was not the same weight he had carried when he built the cabin. This was the weight of living, of choosing a life beyond mere survival. Caleb, as always, didn't hesitate. He simply nodded, a small but knowing smile crossing his face. "We'll make it," he said. "Together." And with that, they turned their backs on the cabin and walked into the wilderness, the sound of their boots crunching in the fresh snow, the only sound between them. As they journeyed, the mountains loomed behind them, silent sentinels watching as they moved forward. The world around them felt vast and unfamiliar, and with every step Samuel realized how small his world had been in the mountains. There was so much more to see, so much more to understand, and this time he wouldn't face it alone. The open road stretched out before them, and with it the promise of discovery. There would be challenges, Samuel knew that, but there would also be life, real life. Life that was full of unknowns, of people, of experiences. The wilderness was no longer his enemy. It had been his teacher, his crucible. But now it was time to learn something new. The first few days on the road were a blur of quiet progress. Samuel and Caleb moved steadily, not in haste, but with a shared purpose that pulled them forward. The road was less a physical path than a mental one. Every step they took away from the cabin was a step into a new chapter of their lives. The snow still clung to the ground, though patches of green began to emerge as the days grew warmer. The mountain peaks, once so close and looming, now seemed distant, silent witnesses to their departure. As the days passed, Samuel found himself reflecting more and more on the life he had left behind. The cabin had been a place of safety, but it had also been a barrier, a wall he had built to keep out the world. Leaving it behind was not just about stepping into a new place, it was about leaving behind everything that had kept him rooted in the past. The pain, the isolation, the grief. For years, he had buried himself in the harsh realities of survival, and in doing so, he had closed himself off from the very things that made life worth living: connection, growth, companionship. But now, walking beside Caleb on the open road, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from surviving a storm or outlasting a winter. It was the kind of hope that came from knowing that the journey ahead held more than just the promise of survival. It held the promise of something deeper, of finding a place in the world again, of reconnecting with life and with others. The silence between them was comfortable, but as the days grew longer, Samuel began to notice how the landscape around them began to shift. The mountains gave way to rolling hills, and the trees started to thin, leaving behind fields of wildflowers and grasses swaying gently in the breeze. It was beautiful, serene, nothing like the harsh, rugged landscape he had left behind. As they sat one evening by the edge of a stream watching the sun dip below the horizon, Caleb spoke again, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. "You know," Caleb said, his voice thoughtful, "I never thought we'd leave the mountains. I thought that was the life for me. But now I'm starting to see that there's more out there, more than just surviving." Samuel nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. He had built his life around surviving, but now he was starting to understand that surviving was only part of the equation. Living, truly living, was something he had to learn. And as he sat by the stream with Caleb beside him, the future didn't seem as daunting as it had in the past. The open road was no longer just a path to travel, it was a path to growth. He looked at Caleb, a sense of gratitude filling his chest. "I never thought I'd find someone to share this with," Samuel admitted quietly. "But I'm glad I did." Caleb smiled, his eyes warm in the fading light. "Me too. We've got a long road ahead of us, but together I think we can handle whatever comes." The past was behind them now, but the future, uncertain and unknown, was theirs to shape. And for the first time in a long while, Samuel felt the weight of it lift from his shoulders. The road ahead wasn't just a path to survival, it was a journey to something far greater, a life worth living. And it was a journey he wouldn't face alone. The road ahead seemed endless, but with every step, Samuel felt the weight of his past lifting. The mountains had been a world of their own, a place of isolation and survival. But now, as they moved farther from the cabin, the world began to open up, revealing landscapes full of possibility. The air felt fresher, the sky broader. And Samuel found himself breathing deeply, letting go of the tension he'd carried for so long. Caleb walked beside him, steady and confident, as if the journey had already become second nature. They spoke little, but there was no need for words. The road was their conversation, the shared silence, a bond that didn't need to be spoken. In the quiet moments, Samuel realized that the hardest part was not leaving the cabin, but accepting that he was capable of more than just surviving. He could live, truly live, beyond the confines he had built for himself. The future was uncertain, but with each passing day, Samuel felt more sure of one thing. This journey, this new beginning, was just the start of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. By the time they reached a small settlement, the journey had transformed them both. The world Samuel had once feared now seemed full of promise. People, once strangers, became a part of the unfolding story, and Samuel found himself willing to connect, willing to experience life beyond mere survival. As they approached the settlement, Caleb gave him a knowing look, his eyes filled with the same quiet anticipation. "This is just the beginning," he said softly, his voice laced with hope. Samuel nodded, a feeling of peace settling over him. The road ahead was still unknown, full of challenges, but for the first time he felt ready to face it. No longer was he just the man who had survived. He was someone who had learned to embrace the world around him, the people, the struggles, the beauty. There would be more trials, more hardships, but they were no longer the focus. Together, they could face whatever came. Samuel didn't know where the road would take him, but he knew that with Caleb by his side, the journey would be worth every step. The past was behind him, and the future, rich with possibility, was finally within reach.